You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're featuring a one-to-one conversation between Adelee Legrand of Intellectual Concepts and Scott Wilkinson of AlphaVu to chat about how transit agencies can get a better handle on how riders and non-riders alike feel about their service. Stay with us.
Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Impact, formerly Railvolution. For a deeper dive on livability issues, visit impactmobility.org, mpactmobility.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Happy New Year and thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. Hope everyone starts 2024 out right, and now let's get back to the show.
Good morning, Scott. I hope you're doing well today. Looking forward to our conversation about this interesting space that we have been occupying, which is public transportation or public mobility. Welcome to the podcast series where we're talking about issues that impact communities. And before we jump into it, I thought it'd be great for me to introduce myself to those who may be listening and then give you the opportunity to do the same, Scott. So my name is Adelee Legrand, and I work for a firm called Intellectual Concepts, where I serve as the strategic advisor. Been in the mobility space for 3 decades, and I'm fortunate to sit on the Impact Board of Directors and serve on the executive committee as the secretary. And for the last, I would say, decade plus, my involvement with Impact has really been about how we better, I would say, connect to the community in the work that we do. As a planner, I have spent most of my career doing planning studies, and I've always wondered if the plans and the studies that were developed 20 years before or 10 years before actually reflect the desires, the needs, the wants of the communities that we are being actually paid to serve. So today, I am so super excited to lead and participate in this conversation with Scott because I've met him during this journey of mine. And Scott, you do such great work. So I thought, well, when this opportunity presented itself, it would be awesome to hear from you and have you share some of what your observations have been, both on a political side as well as in this work of public mobility. So with that, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you to just share a bit about yourself, what you have been doing, how you landed here in this transit space, and then we'll jump into the interview.
Hey, good morning, Adelee. I appreciate you having me on. It's always great to be able to spend time with you and to pick your brain. I'm always appreciative of your perspectives, and you're one of my team's favorite people in the industry. So it's always fun to get to spend some more time with you. Gosh, well, I am the CEO and founder of AlphaVu. We are a public opinion analytics firm. I started the company actually 15 years ago this month. So we have been at it for a while. And I guess my journey to this space is kind of a winding one. But when I was thinking about our conversation this morning, I was thinking about on some of my earlier jobs. And I was having a thought that I don't think it fully really occurred to me before, but my very first job out of college was when I just hated it. I couldn't stand it. But I had gotten a job for the newly elected governor of Virginia, where I grew up. And my job was opening the mail. I was in the mailroom. And my job was to open between 500 and 600 letters every day and to read them. And I had to sort them into ones that had to go to different offices to receive responses, and then pick out the ones that would be answered by the governor's office. And every day I had to write down, keep a list of what topics people wrote about and whether they agreed or disagreed with the governor's position. And I got really good insight into how people communicate with their elected officials, their community leaders, and with how those community leaders understand and process that information. Back in those days, people wrote about not just things they were the angriest about or most opposed to, they wrote about the topics they cared about the most. And so that means you got both sides. Back then, you had the luxury of sitting down. The governor would take a stack of mail and sit down and read through it at his leisure and get a good sense of what the people thought. And a lot has changed since those days. But I'd say that was really kind of my grounding in understanding this communication with the public and how people communicate and how we understand those communications.
So that is really interesting, Scott. And you can know someone in the industry from, I would say, afar, or even working with them on projects, but not until you sit down and have this kind of conversation do you learn that they started off opening mail in the mailroom. I can think of all the things I could have made, little funny comments about during the years if I had known that, right? But now I do, Scott. So just be prepared. After going through that experience and working in the governor's office and understanding, that there is community engagement, what motivated you to move from this political space into the public transit space as it relates to just, did you even see yourself in this space?
Honestly, I did not. A number of years after I had had that experience working for elected officials, I was running a technology business that was doing survey research. It was doing polling. And I had been to graduate school by that time, and I found out at graduate school I really liked statistics. That was just something I had a natural affinity for. And so as part of this work in doing survey research, I was building targeting models. And targeting in marketing and communications is something everybody does. If it's political, if you're a consumer product, it's all about just understanding how to spend your money most effectively. Who should you be talking to and what message is going to be most interesting to them? And there's all math behind that. I got really frustrated in that experience because targeting models like that are usually built on polling, on telephone polls. And even 15 years ago, there were problems with telephone polls. We think about the problems we see today. I mean, they were there 15 years ago. The biggest problem is you run an organization 365 days a year. If you're polling at all, you're maybe in the field with a poll 3 or 5 days a year. Well, what are you doing the other 360 days? And with the speed of information and the amount of information, my basic premise was we just need to have more intelligence on what the public is saying and thinking every day of the year. And that's what I started the business to do. It was really only about 5 years into having the company that we started to work in transit. And honestly, it was just happenstance. I knew some people who said, hey, you need to come to these folks, talk to these folks. I think they would find this interesting. And one of the first people who I talked to was Gary Thomas, who was general manager of DART in Dallas. And he really sort of picked up on what we were working on. And he said, something I've never forgotten. He's like, transit has a really unique problem. We have to have the support of people who don't use our product.
Right.
And that it's unique. It's an interesting problem. If you're Coca-Cola, you don't spend time or money advertising to hardcore Pepsi drinkers, right?
Right.
It's just not going to happen. But if you're a transit agency, you need to have public awareness and support of people who will not get out from behind the the wheel of their cars.
Right.
And so that's what we really started doing initially in transit, is helping transit agencies understand community beyond their own riders and help them burnish their brands outside of the people who were on the service every day.
Right. And it's interesting. You shared that it wasn't, I would say, your North Star to get into the transit space and figure out what the community is actually saying. It just, you talk to someone who said, yeah, this may be a good space for you to, at least test the waters. Right. And, that's not unique for me as well. I went to grad school for transportation and I started off in logistics. And then there was a conversation, why don't you come and work in the public mobility space? It's moving things, you're just moving people instead of goods. So, sometimes the journey takes you to a place where you didn't even think about, but then when you get there, you're like, wow, this is pretty cool and I'm happy to be here. On that note, though, and I agree with you 100%, right? In the transit space, you do have to spend a lot of time convincing people who don't use your product and people who probably will never use your product to support it and fund it. With that being said, we also realize that, every trip is not taken by the same mode. So before we jump into the core of our discussion, I am curious, what is your favorite non-car mode and where do you take it?
Oh, there's no doubt. I live in Baltimore. Our headquarters is in Washington, D.C. And so I take the MARC train to commuter rail to D.C. and back to Baltimore at least 3 days a week. And I got to tell you, it is so much fun. You get to know people there. About a week ago, or maybe it was just before the holidays, I was on the train on my ride home, and there were a group of friends on the train who have ridden together for decades, and one of them was on his last trip because he was retiring. And they broke out bottles of liquor and food and had a big old party. Everybody on that car was having a good old time. It was just
Wow.
something you don't get in your car. It was a lot of fun. That's my favorite mode, no doubt.
That definitely sounds like fun. I don't know how the Mark folks would feel about that. I'm sure they're breaking all sorts of rules, but it was a fun time. So that is great. Thanks for sharing that. So let's get into the core of our conversation and really talking about data analytics and the work that you do. And I think it's so timely because we just kicked off our 2024 election cycle. And here we are, right back in the throes of polling. Everybody's familiar with hearing that word, polling, what the polls say, and understanding the data. So I'd like to hear from you, Scott, from a perspective of transit, understanding the data. How does elections or how do elections impact the transit space, and how do you utilize the data that comes from all the data sources? And if you could spend a little bit of time sharing what those data sources are, how do you use that data to really start to leverage what the folks in the, I would say, political space use the data to help candidates or parties understand where they're moving forward? How do you use that same type of data to help transit agencies?
The communications landscape has just changed so dramatically from those days when I was, opening the mail. Like I said, back then, you could read through a stack of mail and get a good sense of what people think. But the fact of the matter is today, if you scroll through your Facebook feed, you get a sense of only what a small selection of people who are curated for you by an algorithm think.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, pretty much every source of information you look at is the same thing. It's curated for you in some way. And that creates all kinds of strange incentives. And it's really hard when that's all you see, that's all any of us see every day, to remember that what you're seeing is not necessarily representative of what the community thinks. And I think it's a really important thing, both for transit agencies to understand and the elected officials who govern them. You really have to do extra work to be able to understand what the community thinks and why. It's not going to come to you in the mail, and it's not going to come to you on your phone. People have the luxury of being able to communicate in so many different ways now, by email, by social media. They can call a transit agency's call center. They can post something on social without it being on the transit agency's page. It could be on the mayor's page, or the member of Congress's page, or on their own page. They could be sending emails. They could be attending community meetings. And it's really important for transit agencies to understand they have to collect across all of those possible channels and put all of those representations of people's opinions together in one place to really start to be able to get a good sense of what the community thinks. Elected officials, they have their own incentives. They want to presumably have a policy agenda, and they want to get reelected. Right. And
Right.
so I think it's for the transit agencies, they have a responsibility to always remember that the elected officials have their own incentives. And it's incumbent on us to make sure we align to the best we can with their incentives. Because at the end of the day, they're ones who get elected to make decisions. And hopefully that's not going to change.
So, you mentioned a good point, right? So there's so much information being thrown at us all the time. And I believe that it's like over 2,000 advertisements every single day individuals are exposed to. And even if you just open your phone, right? I'm not a big social media person at all, but if I just open my phone to look at my emails or text someone, the next thing you see is like some ad that popped up, right? Or you're reading an article, even if you subscribe to like the New York Times or, your local paper, like some ads are going to pop up. And how do you navigate, right? And how do you, as an agency, let's say, how do you take the fact that people are so exposed to so much advertisement to maneuver through that to get your message to really resonate with people who are, living their lives, right? Like understanding more about transit is probably not on the top of anybody's list, even the person who's riding it every day, right? So how do you navigate that? And what are the tools that agencies and I would say practitioners should be aware of that they can utilize to help get through all of that noise, if you will, through the advertisements that everyone is seeing?
It's a great point, and that 2000 advertisements. I mean, just think about that for a second. From the time you wake up to the time you go to bed, 2000 ads. How many of those do you remember? Close to zero, right?
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
those ads are being put out there by a lot of them by huge consumer product companies that have really big budgets. Again, if you're Nike or you're Coca-Cola, if you want to affect public opinion, you go and spend a ton of money to do that. Transit agencies do not and will not have that luxury. I'm not saying advertising doesn't have a role, but I think we need a little humility to understand that a transit agency is never going to compete in advertising on the level that most of the companies out there can who are advertising. So that means we have to be smarter. We have to be smarter and more targeted, and to make those dollars go farther. That's where my team and our business, we do a lot of measurement around public sentiment. So when people are talking about transit across all of those channels we mentioned, is it positive? Is it negative? Which way is it trending? And importantly, what's causing it to change? Is it what's causing public sentiment to become more positive or more negative? Because if we can identify the causal factors, that gives us something very targeted we can go after. Sometimes we see a drop in public sentiment and it'll be tied to an operational issue. A bus is broken down or there's a delay or something. And that's totally expected, right? We don't expect people to be happy about operational issues. But sometimes we'll see a drop in sentiment that has got nothing to do with an operational issue. It could be just some misinformation that's out there. And that is a real opportunity where a transit agency can go in, they can put some content out, they can advertise, they can make a statement, and they can have a real significant impact for really a very small or reasonable investment. And it's that kind of precision that's really necessary in the modern communications environment.
I like what you said there as far as really, understanding the sentiment. So when there are these negative perceptions that are out there, and sometimes there's another outfit that is putting the negative messaging out into the community. How do we counter the anti-transit messaging that the community is hearing in a way that makes sense, right? It's not a waste of money. Like you said, you can't over advertise, but how do we as practitioners and those who work in the space, and even those who may be the head of community organizations that understand that there is value to supporting public transit, how do we work in your space, I would say, to really counter the anti-transit messaging in a way that doesn't break the budget and makes sense and they'll give you results?
Yeah, well, as public agencies, we're burdened with having to tell the truth. I'll start with that. There are organizations out there that are in campaign mode that frankly can say whatever they want to say, whether it's true or not. If you're a public agency and you're communicating with the public about services, capital projects, or whatever the case may be, you have a legal and moral obligation to only speak facts, to tell the truth. That can be a challenge. But I think one of the things is understanding that there are some people who you're not going to persuade. And that's okay. There are people who have made up their minds. They're not interested in what you have to say. Being able to know who they are so that you don't waste your time and your money trying to communicate with them, that in itself is a win. You're not wasting resources on something where in an area where you're not going to have any effect. But what we can do is we can understand the populations that are genuinely interested in information about the service. We can understand populations that may be vulnerable to misinformation and make sure that we get the facts in their hands so that they have access to the facts. I think that's a really important function of communications in public agencies. But to do all that, we have to know where the community is, who they are, and how to reach them. And that is just that's a massive project. It's a massive data project in this day and age, but it can be done. But I just think we have to remember that we're working in the context of we have to tell the truth, and we have to understand that there's some people who just aren't interested in it.
So, let's talk about telling the truth, right? So earlier we talked about the fact that in this public mobility space, a lot of the support that you need are from people who are not customers, who may never become customers, and you need their support because they'll come out and vote or whatever the litany of reasons are. So if you go back to getting out there and getting the message and telling the truth, do we spend the time focusing and communicating with the customers, or should the time be spent focusing on those folks that you need their support to keep the lights on? And how do you balance that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. That's the big question. And I have a few thoughts, and there's people who certainly disagree with me on this. But I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge the fact that, and I'm speaking in broad terms here, there's certain exceptions to what I'm going to say, of course. I'm just speaking in broad strokes. By and large, public transit ridership is largely impacted by macroeconomic factors. So gas prices, unemployment, public health situations, things like that. And paid advertising has only a marginal impact, right? I know we may talk about AI a little later, but some of the work my company is doing in AI, we've gotten to the point now where we can actually forecast, okay, gas prices drop $1 a gallon. You're going to lose a certain number of riders. This is how many riders we think you can get back by increasing your advertising budget. That's great because it lets you calculate a cost per new rider. It lets you be really efficient. But what those models also say is that there's really no amount of advertising that you can spend that's going to get the riders back you lost from that big of a drop in gas prices. I think that's really important to know.
Right.
It helps elected officials, it helps board members understand that what is within and that what is not within the power of the transit agency, right? There are things that are just out of our control. What does that mean for our communications and branding? Paid advertising has a role, certainly. But I think what it leads us to have to recognize is that the primary focus of our communications, of our branding, has to be at helping the community understand, the community at large understand the value of public transit. We of course, have to be communicating with our riders, make sure they have the information they need to be able to use the system. But by and large, a big focus of our communication needs to be advancing the brand and reminding the community the value, the overall value, whether you're a rider or not.
No, I totally get that. And, we have this philosophy, if I may, that we like to say that the work we do in the public mobility space, in the planning space, is really toward creating and supporting more sustainable and just communities. But what are the people actually saying? And I'm asking you this question, not rhetorically, but from the sentiments and all the data that you and your team has gone through all over the country, what are people saying around public mobility? Do they see it as, a great commute option for the 21st century, or are they looking for other types of services, from the bus to the train to, I don't know, an electric scooter to an autonomous, I don't know, unicycle? There are all sorts of things that are out in the space right now. So I'm just curious, like, what are people actually saying? Those who are using the system, what is it that they want? And are we giving them what they're looking for?
It's a great question. A lot of people in the industry, it goes back to getting caught in sort of the circle of certain communities and who you're listening to and hearing from. It's really easy if you work in a transit agency to sort of get in the middle of an urbanist group of people who like love transit and care about these urban issues. And that's great. It's a really important community. They're incredibly supportive of transit. But it is so important, even in the densest, most urban cities in this country, to realize that that urbanist community is often not representative of the larger community and how they think and what they think about. If I had to make some broad brushstrokes here, the thing I would say is that people are busy with their own lives. They're going to work, they're taking their kids to school, they're going to the grocery store, they're getting an older parent to healthcare. They don't care about anything relative to transit than if it's easy for them to do what they need to do.
Right.
And if it really is easy, cost effective, they'll use it. But if they think it's not easy enough, they won't. And so, that, and a lot of people, we've done a lot of research over the country and, we've asked people, do you use transit? And if they say no, we say, okay, why not? And they say, well, I don't live close enough to, a bus stop. And we will be able to know that they live within like 5 blocks of a bus stop, for example, right? And it is just a cold, hard truth that a lot of people will not walk 5 blocks to a bus stop. And then, of course, there's the issue of how long it would take them to do that and get there versus getting in their car. And those conversations can be hard to hear, but they are far more common than not. And we just have to understand that's how people think. And that needs us to work backwards and think, okay, is there something we should do about that in terms of service or redesigning the system? Or are we just going to be willing to live with that and understand that we have the ridership that we have, given what we can do with our capital costs and our service as it is?
That's a good point too, Scott, as far as, understanding what the customers' expectations are, as well as those who are not customers, why they are saying it's difficult, especially, if you're using the system and it's easy to navigate, but it's because, it's easy to navigate. You've done it. How we reach people who may feel like, hey, this is too difficult. I'm just going to stick with what I know. And I think that's human nature, right? People are comfortable doing what they've always done. As we start thinking about the different modes or the new innovations in the space of public mobility, I did mention autonomous vehicles. I did have an opportunity. I was fortunate. I was in Phoenix. So shout out to Phoenix, Arizona, and they had Waymo out there as an autonomous option that you could do like an Uber or Lyft. And that was pretty interesting, getting a vehicle with no driver at all. And it's just like a monitor that's welcoming you to get on board. And I know there's lots of other companies that are deploying this technology in different cities across the country. And, this is all technology too, right? So I'm just curious, like with AI and all of what's out there right now, just for the normal consumer, can you share a bit about the role of AI in the work that you do and how transit agencies should be thinking about utilizing AI? And also, I'd like to hear, because there's folks who are going to be listening in, and some people are very concerned about AI and what does that mean? And as it continues to develop, how much of our, I would say, privacy are we really giving up, right? And how much control are we giving up? So if you can really talk about AI and go as in depth as you feel necessary, but to really help people, one, understand what AI is in our space of public mobility, and then two, what the positives are and what the potential, I would say, drawbacks of AI could be in public mobility.
It's such an exciting area. There's so much going on. I think it's really important that leaders in the transit industry do 2 things at the same time. They start to get involved in AI because it's coming. So they might as well start to dive in now. But they also need to think methodically about it, just like you suggested. Understand its role, its pros, its potential drawbacks, and really start to build some policies out around all those things. We've done a lot of research. I'll start out on the autonomous vehicle side. We've done research in multiple markets, and What's interesting is that the two greatest concerns among the public are, one, safety, and two, the impact on employment. I don't think that surprises anybody. And for the autonomous vehicle perspective, I think the industry understands that this has to be incredibly safe. There's got to be a demonstrable record of that. It really goes for those of us who work on the data side with AI. It's really the same thing. Safety. We have to be absolutely first and foremost concerned about data privacy and data security. And then we have to help really understand how this is likely to impact people's jobs. On the data privacy and security side, there are, I would say, generally in the data world, there are three areas of data that are considered really sensitive. Anything regarding health, anything regarding like finance, credit card numbers, that sort of thing. And then personally identifiable information, or PII. That's like your name, your address, your phone number. My company, we don't deal with credit card numbers. We don't deal with health data. So it's just that PII. The standards that we have established are we never transmit PII through an AI model.
Okay.
So any AI processing that gets done with that data happens on our own servers. It doesn't go to Microsoft. It doesn't go to OpenAI. It doesn't go to Google. It doesn't go anywhere else. And so that helps our customers maintain complete control and ownership of it.
So as a transit agency or one of your clients, is that something that should be written into the procurement document so that whoever they choose, they know that they're protecting their community by putting this in the procurement documents?
Absolutely. And I will say we have just started in the last few months to see some really strong language in contracts in that regard. And anyone who is not doing that absolutely should be. Ultimately, the transit agency is the ones who will get blamed, whether it's not their fault or not. So they need to be sure they have the safeguards in place. We take the use and management and control of PII very seriously. And our policy is to be extra safe and simply not send it anywhere else. There are AI tools where you can send that kind of data and do certain things with it. Our judgment at this point is none of those things are important enough to risk sending the PII out, so we don't do it.
Well, that's good to know. And then hopefully, those who are listening who are in the space of procurement, they understand and they can get more information on how to put that language in contracts to ensure that they're protecting the community. So let's talk a bit about the benefits, right, of utilizing AI. And I guess it's not whether transit agencies will use AI, because like you said, it's embedded in some of what we're doing right now for daily engagements, but who will benefit from, really being deliberate in how you deploy AI?
I think a main benefit is, we are awash in a sea of data. Everybody has access to so many dashboards, so much data. I think we've gotten to the point where we're not taking advantage of it like we could. Nobody has the time to spend every day looking at like complex dashboards day in and day out and trying to figure out, what to do with it all. One of the main benefits of AI is it really, in an intuitive and quick way, is going to go through huge amounts of data for us and give us the lessons we need quickly. An example is, something that we're working on right now, where a general manager will be able to say to her phone, I'm going to go speak to this neighborhood this evening at the Kiwanis Club. Given what that community has been saying about transit and our recent on-time performance, and keeping in mind that the city council person from that district will be in the room, give me a 5-minute speech and send it to my phone. And the AI is going to do that in a few seconds. And it's going to include the talking points are going to accommodate the realities of the on-time performance in that neighborhood. And it will help you to understand what that community has been thinking before you go in the room, so you're not caught off guard. And it will also understand that there are people in the room who are elected officials who have certain positions, will take certain votes, and be able to draft a statement that you may need to go back and edit, but it'll be 90% of the way there, and you could do it you do it on the bus when you're going to the meeting.
Wow. So pretty much it'll help you get a lay of the land before you walk into the room and then be prepared to address the folks. I guess it's addressing the audience, right? Knowing who the audience is and not in a general term, but specifically, and then being able to address their specific needs. Can you also use AI to predict? And I think earlier you talked about, predicting ridership, like you had models that could do that based on the price of gasoline or the change in unemployment. But can you also use AI to predict how many riders you'll get, let's say after COVID or after a major event that may impact ridership? Can it be used as a tool to do that as well?
Yeah, I'll say we're working on it.
Okay.
We're really working on understanding, transit agencies are pretty good at understanding and predicting, ridership given service availability, given the season, whether schools are in or not, those sorts of things. But being able to predict near-term ridership based on like a change in unemployment, based on what's happening in the news. So maybe there was an operational issue, but how does the news reporting about that operational issue impact your ridership over the next few days?
Okay.
Those are the type things that are coming in the next few months, and it's going to be these models are going to be much better predicting what happens when very unexpected things occur and helping you adjust and recover from them much more quickly than you may have been able to do in the past.
Well, I like that. I mean, being able to be more responsive is always a good thing, especially if you have reliable data. So, throughout our conversation this morning or today, if you will, Scott, you've mentioned a couple of things, several times. Audience segmenting and sentiment, right? So, can you spend a little time just explaining what the difference is between audience segmenting and audience sentiment?
Sure. So sentiment just really means favorability or support or opposition. And so when we collect public opinion data from all across the channels a public transit agency may have, whether it's the call center or their social media or wherever the case, we basically have a huge body of text of things that people said. And we do a few things with that text. We pull out what topics people are talking about. So they're talking about their bus route, for example.
Right.
And then we are able to measure using AI algorithms, was what they said positive or negative? Generally, people don't say a lot of positive things about their bus route if things are going well. Occasionally that happens. It's nice to see. What we usually see is negative sentiment about a bus route when there's a problem. So, if the bus is late, something like that. And so we have basically a big body of data of people talking about transit related issues, and we know how positively or negatively they are speaking about each topic over time. What we do is we break that population out into different segments. People who care about buses, people who care about rail, people who care about pass costs, people who care about access for people with different abilities. And segmentation is really about being able to break the population into groups so that you're talking to them about things they care about. And maybe it's a segment of people who have been hearing a lot of negativity about transit, but who you think would be receptive to some more positive factual information. That's really important from a brand perspective. So there are lots of ways to sort of segment the population. And a segment, by the way, can be a segment of the population who's never spoken about you, right?
Right.
And that can be a really important segment in who you decide to communicate with. So it's really about understanding the entire population, both your ridership and your not a ridership, and then breaking that population down into these various segments so that given the budget, given the time, given the resources, you're talking to the segments of the population that are most critical to helping you achieve your goals. That can change very quickly. You may need to talk to these segments today and different segments tomorrow. And being able to have that agility and flexibility is really critical to success.
So you should, and I'm just trying to make sure I understand this clearly. You understand your segments and the sentiment that's associated with that, and then you utilize the data to help inform how you communicate with those groups. Is that a good way to?
The goal is, I would say the goal is something we said back at the very beginning. The goal is to get an honest understanding of what the community really thinks. That's the first thing. For transit leaders to really have an honest, unbiased understanding of what the population really and truly thinks. No good communication can happen until that happens. Once transit leaders really understand what the community thinks, what they're saying, what they care about, that's when good communication plans and outreach strategies can be built.
Okay, well, Scott, you have left us with a lot to think about. Before we close, there are a couple of questions I just want to make sure that we walk through so that we don't leave anything hanging. I would say, again, back to the fact that we have just kicked off our 2024 political season, and there's going to be a lot of information that's thrown out there, a lot of misinformation, as you clearly stated. Not all of us are governed by being truthful. So we do have to navigate, and I would expect that, if transit gets brought up into the conversation, that transit agencies need to be vigilant in making sure that they get the message out to their key segments, if you will, and making sure that people understand what the agencies are doing. I would say, what are some key things to keep in mind when you think about, bringing projects forward or investments forward, especially during this period of time, right? If we say the next, 9 months or so, what are some of the key things that decision makers need to keep in mind as they are navigating and moving their projects forward in this environment that's happening in the real world in real time?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, particularly in this election year. Transit leaders have to operate in a very unpredictable environment. I don't think any of us knows what's going to happen in November. And so we have to implement a strategy that is going to more than likely leave us in the best place no matter what happens. I think that means being really brand vigilant. Certainly that means taking care of your customers. But we have to be really aggressive in communicating the value of our service, of our capital projects, of any potential changes we have for funding, and how that will value the community. And those values have to be communicated in the terms that each community cares about most. That could be employment and jobs. It could be technical advancement. It could be the environment. It could be standards of living, lots of different things that are going to be different from community to community. But it's important that, we really protect ourselves and have advanced the mission by being brand vigilant. And that requires not using standard talking points that I think it's circulated in the industry a lot, but by really listening to what your community thinks, understanding how they talk, how they communicate, and using that to build your brand strategy and your brand message to communicate with your constituents over these next few months. It's going to be a really, really critical time to do that and do it well.
Well, is there anything that we did not discuss, Scott, that you are itching to talk about as we have a couple of minutes before we close?
Gosh, no, we talked about a lot, but I just want to thank you for your leadership in this industry and everything you do. We appreciate you. And like I said, it's fun to get to talk to you, and I hope we'll get to do it some more soon.
Well, Scott, the feeling is mutual. I really do enjoy talking with you and talking to people who are thinking in a way that will help us move forward in a sustainable manner and really help the community. Because at the end of the day, we're doing this to make sure that people can have a better quality of life. And it takes big thought and action to do that. How can we reach you? I'm sure after listening to all that we talked about in this short period of time, folks are going to have lots of questions. So how can you be reached?
Sure. Our website is alphavu.com. It's ALPHAVU.com. And my email is Scott, SCOTT, at alphavu.com. And we're responsive. We listen to our customers, so we're pretty easy to reach.
Right. You have the algorithm,
That's
So
right.
thank you so much, Scott, for spending time with us today. We, on behalf of Impact, we're happy to add you to our list of podcasts and hope you have a great day and good luck this, I would say, 2024 election cycle. So good luck to you.
Thank you, Adelee.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.